"I'll marry you if you can fit into this dress." The millionaire laughed, thinking he'd humiliate her forever. But time passed, and she made the whole world stand and applaud. The smell of freshly waxed floors still hung in the air as Olivia Carter straightened the last vase of white lilies at the entrance to the hall. Each petal seemed more valuable than the money she made in a week of cleaning. That night's event promised to be the grandest of the year, the fall fashion show of designer Alexander Grant, the most sought-after name in Latin American fashion. She adjusted her simple gray uniform, the right pocket slightly torn, and hid her trembling hands inside it. She liked watching, from a distance, the sparkle behind the scenes, the murmurs of makeup artists, the rhythmic snip of scissors through fabric, hangers sliding like musical notes in a symphony of luxury. Among all the displayed pieces, there was one that seemed to have a life of its own, a scarlet red silk dress that caught the light like liquid fire. It was the highlight of the night. People said Alexander had designed it for the woman no one dares to be. Olivia watched it whenever she could, the way someone might gaze at a sunset through a narrow window. She didn't exactly want it, not in that way, but something about it hypnotized her. When the guests began to arrive, the hall transformed into another world. Cameras flashed, laughter echoed between champagne glasses, and expensive perfume filled the air. Olivia moved quietly among the tables, collecting forgotten napkins and empty glasses, invisible amid the manufactured beauty. In one corner, Alexander Grant smiled, surrounded by journalists. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he could move planets with a snap of his fingers. People called him a genius, a visionary, the alchemist of fabric. He wore a custom-made black suit, every gesture calculated. Even his arrogance seemed part of the brand. Olivia passed by him while picking up a tray. Alexander gave her a distracted glance. One of those looks that doesn't see but merely passes through. Yet one of the guests noticed her. A tall, cheerful man in a light-colored suit, a champagne flute in hand. "Hey, Alexander," he said, nodding toward her. "Why don't you have her walk the runway? That'd be unusual." The laughter started soft, then grew louder. Alexander smirked, savoring the moment. "Unusual is a polite way to say disaster," he replied. "But tell you what." He turned to Olivia, who stood frozen, unsure whether to walk away. "I'll make you a promise, miss. If you can fit into that red dress, I'll marry you." Laughter exploded again, louder, crueler. Someone recorded it on their phone. Olivia felt the blood rush to her face, as if the entire dress had been sewn into her skin. She wanted to respond, but her voice died before it reached her lips. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to leave, tripped over a chair, heard someone whisper, "Poor thing," and ran. The sound of heels and laughter blurred together in her head as she pushed open the bathroom door and locked herself inside. For a moment, silence. Her heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo in her temples. In the mirror, the woman staring back looked like someone else. Red-rimmed eyes, wet face, hunched posture. Shame had weight. She leaned against the cold wall and let the tears fall. She wasn't crying just for that moment. She cried for all the days she had been invisible, for every time she had cleaned someone else's mess without being seen, for all the small dreams she'd learned to silence. When the sobs faded, only the sound of her breathing remained. Olivia looked at her reflection again. Something was different. A spark, small but persistent, like the reflection of a flame about to grow. She whispered hoarsely to herself, "One day, I'll wear it, but it'll be for me." She stayed like that for a while, repeating the words until she believed them, not as a wish, but a decision. When she came out, the event was reaching its peak. Music thumped, flashes lit up the hall. She stayed in the shadows of the side corridor, watching without being seen. On stage, Alexander gave a rehearsed speech about beauty, power, and female freedom. The models glided one after another, living sculptures. And then, the red dress appeared. The crowd held its breath. It was magnificent. No one could deny that. The fabric danced with every step of the model, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to spin around that color. Olivia watched in silence. She felt both pain and fascination, the same fire that burned and drew her in. It was the same dress that carried her humiliation, but now it also carried her resolve. Every fold, every stitch called her toward a different fate. When the lights dimmed and the applause filled the hall, she already knew. That night would not be remembered only as the day she was ridiculed. It would be the beginning. Outside, the cold, late-night wind carried traces of the expensive perfume escaping through the hall doors. Olivia walked slowly down the damp sidewalk, her hands still trembling but her head held high. She looked back one last time. Through the tall windows, she saw the reflection of the red dress under the stage lights, glowing like a distant flame. And in that instant, she swore silently that one day she would wear something like it, not to prove anything to anyone, but so she'd never again feel small before anyone. The laughter from that night still echoed in Olivia's head for days. Sometimes it came in flashes, the clinking of glasses, the gleam of lights, Alexander Grant's voice, cold and sharp as scissors. "I'll marry you if you can fit into that dress." She tried to ignore it, but the memory returned during the most ordinary moments, while mopping the office floor, washing bathrooms, carrying buckets that seemed to grow heavier each day. The shame clung to her like dust that wouldn't come off, no matter how hard she scrubbed. Every morning, the alarm rang at 5. She got up without enthusiasm, but something inside her had changed. It wasn't just exhaustion anymore. It was hunger, a new hunger, nameless, mixed with anger and the desire to change. In the cracked mirror of the room she shared with her sister, she saw an ordinary woman. Hair tied back, dark circles under her eyes, uniform hanging behind the door. But behind that tired image, there was a new look, a spark asking for space. That morning before leaving for work, she did something she'd never done. She stood in front of the mirror for a full minute without looking away, then whispered to herself, like making a pact, "I'm going to change this story." In the following days, she started slowly. First, short walks before her morning shift. Her body ached, her legs felt heavy, but she kept going. Then, with what little she earned, she joined a small neighborhood gym where the rusty machines contrasted with the dreams of those trying to start over. At first, she felt out of place among the other members, young, energetic, dressed in tight, colorful clothes. She, in a loose t-shirt and simple pants, seemed invisible there too. But unlike the fancy hall, here the others' looks didn't diminish her. They made her stronger. Each drop of sweat was a silent response to the laughter still echoing in her mind. The first few months were tough. The physical exhaustion piled onto hard labor and loneliness. There were days she almost quit. But every time she thought about stopping, she remembered the red dress under the lights and the promise she'd made to herself that she would rise above it. Olivia began to change from within, too. She gave up soda, fried food, and the sweet buns she used to carry in her pocket for breaks. She brought simple homemade meals, vegetables and brown rice. Her sister found it strange, sometimes even laughed. "Why all this, Mary? It's just work." And she'd answer calmly, "It's not for work. It's for me." Weeks turned into months. Her body began to reshape, her posture to change. But the biggest transformation wasn't physical. It was in her gaze. Olivia, who once looked away when spoken to, now held people's eyes. One rainy afternoon, leaving the gym, she saw a crumpled flyer stuck to a lamppost. "Eleanor Foster Atelier seeks sewing assistant. Must be dedicated and willing to learn." She stood there, reading the words for a long moment. Eleanor Foster. The name rang a bell. She remembered it from old magazines, a veteran seamstress known for her perfectionism, who had once worked with top designers, including Alexander Grant himself. Olivia's heart raced. Would it be crazy to try? She had no training, no resume, only determination, and that was all she had left. The next day, she went to the address on the flyer, a small old building smelling of new fabric and hot iron. The walls were covered with patterns and sketches. Behind a cutting table sat a middle-aged woman with her hair in a tight bun, Eleanor Foster. Olivia took a deep breath before speaking. I saw the flyer. I came to ask about the job. Eleanor looked up over her glasses. Have you worked with sewing before? No, but I learned fast. The woman studied her from head to toe. You think you can stand all day, listen to machines rattling, deal with hot irons and a demanding boss? I think I've handled worse. Eleanor gave a faint smile. All right, stay this week. If I like your work, you stay for good. And that's how Olivia entered this new world. At first, her days were about observation. She learned quietly, watching the other seamstresses measure fabric, baste pieces, discuss patterns. At night, she watched old videos on tailoring, mimicking movements in the air. Soon, she was helping with small tasks, cutting threads, marking hems, holding fabric steady. Eleanor, though strict, noticed the spark in the young woman's eyes. You've got light hands, girl, and a careful heart. That's worth more than a diploma. Those simple words were the first sincere compliment Olivia had received in years. That night, she walked home feeling the ground beneath her feet had changed, as if, for the first time, she was walking toward something truly hers. Months later, she handled the sewing machine with confidence. Her fingers had calluses, but also quiet pride. The rhythmic sound of the needle-piercing fabric felt like a heartbeat, a reminder that life moved on, stitch by stitch. Sometimes, while sewing, she thought of that night, the hall, the laughter, the red dress. But the memory no longer hurt. Now, it fueled her. One morning, Eleanor entered with a stack of new patterns and said casually, "This one's for Mr. Grant. Want to help with the finishing?" Olivia froze. The name still had weight, but she took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and replied, "I do." As she smoothed the fabric, a shiver ran through her arms. It was destiny brushing against her once more, and this time, she'd be ready. The invisible cleaner was becoming the woman who would sew her own fate, stitch by stitch. The hum of sewing machines formed its own kind of music, a rhythm of metal, thread, and breath. It was the soundtrack of Eleanor Foster's atelier, where Olivia now spent her days. Here, every stitch was treated like a word, every fabric like a story. And she, who once cleaned other people's floors, now touched with her own hands the fabrics that dressed dreams. At first, her tasks were simple, trimming loose threads, pressing fabrics, aligning patterns. But Olivia did everything with near sacred attention. She watched the other seamstresses as if studying a new language, noticing how they held the scissors, the exact pressure on the sewing pedal, the way fabric seemed to obey those who truly knew how to guide it. Eleanor Foster, in her black apron and sharp eyes, watched over everyone's work. She was firm, blunt, but fair. In fashion, girl, haste is the enemy of the soul, she'd say. A badly sewn dress is like a poorly kept secret. It'll open where it shouldn't. Olivia would smile quietly and keep sewing. She came to love that rhythm, the smell of new fabric, the buzz of needles, the steam from the iron passing over silk. Sometimes she stayed late, helping organize patterns after everyone else had gone. Eleanor, noticing, would leave a thermos of coffee on the table and say, "Talent likes silence, work in peace." But not all silence was peaceful. One afternoon, While organizing a pile of new patterns, Olivia saw a name printed on golden tags. Exclusive collection, Alexander Grant. Her heart stopped. The letters seemed to jump off the paper, shouting back her humiliation. For a moment, her hands sweated. The memory of that night returned. The lights, the laughter, the cruel promise. She took a deep breath. The temptation to avoid those tags was strong, but she didn't. She picked one up, studied it closely, and with her usual care, began to attach it to the fabric. If I'm sewing his name, she thought, it'll be with the steadiness of someone who won't bow anymore. Eleanor noticed her expression. Everything all right, Olivia? She looked up, masking her emotion. Yes. Just the name sounds familiar. Ah, Alexander? Yeah, I worked for him years ago. A talent, sure, but a peacock. Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. Working for him takes precision. He notices everything. Olivia simply nodded. Inside, the old wound burned, but along with it came something new, a deep desire to prove her worth, not to him, but to herself. In the following days, Olivia began receiving more complex tasks. Her co-workers whispered about how neat her stitches were, how the fabric seemed to fall more gracefully under her hands. What had begun as learning became instinct. With every perfect seam, she felt something inside her realigning. Eleanor watched from afar. "You've got a gift, girl," she said one night as they packed the pieces for the next show. "The difference between someone who sews and someone who creates is simple. The first does what they're told. The second listens to what the fabric wants to say." "You listen to the fabric, Olivia. That's rare." Those words echoed. For the first time, someone saw art in her hands. One morning, the atelier buzzed with tension. Eleanor had received an urgent order. The main dress for Alexander Grant's new collection needed repairs before the show. The fabric, a deep, almost crimson red, lay spread across the central table. One side had been cut wrong, the embroidery uneven. "I need steady hands for this," Eleanor said, scanning the room. Then her eyes settled on Olivia. "It's yours." Olivia's heart raced. "Me?" "Yes. I've watched you long enough. It's delicate work, but you can handle it." For a second, Olivia thought of saying no. The red fabric seemed to mock her, a ghost from the past. But she took a deep breath, walked to the table, and ran her fingers across the silk. It was soft, delicate, warm to the touch, as if alive. "I'll do it," she said firmly. For hours, she worked in absolute silence. Each stitch was a confrontation with her past, a way to reclaim what had been taken from her that night. The memories returned. Alexander's voice, the crowd's laughter, her reflection in the bathroom mirror. But now they didn't paralyze her. They propelled her. Eleanor watched quietly from afar, noticing how Olivia held her breath before each difficult seam, as if measuring not only the fabric, but her own pain. When she finished, the dress was flawless, the stitching invisible, the embroidery restored, the fit perfect. Eleanor ran her hand over the fabric, evaluating. "Perfect," she said with rare satisfaction. "Who would have thought? This is the same fabric that almost made me quit once." Olivia looked up. "You worked with him too?" "I did. And I learned what it means to have talent without humility. Fashion's like that. The ones who shine are the ones on stage, but it's the invisible hands that hold the show together." Olivia smiled faintly, understanding every word. When the dress was packed and sent off for the show, she stayed alone in the room, staring at the empty space where the red fabric had been. The sunlight streamed through the windows, turning the loose threads on the table to gold. She picked one up and wound it around her fingers. "One day," she whispered, "I'll sew my own red dress, and it'll say whatever I want it to." That night, She went to bed exhausted, but with a light heart. The past still burned, but now it was a fire that illuminated, not destroyed. The humiliated cleaner was becoming the craftswoman who, stitch by stitch, was rebuilding herself. Time had turned into an unbroken line of work, silence, and learning. By day, Olivia was one of the most dedicated seamstresses in Eleanor Foster's atelier. At night, when the lights went out and the neighborhood fell asleep, she would go home, switch on the small lamp on her table, and let the sound of the scissors take the place of her heartbeat. There, in the quiet of her room, the secret project was born. A red dress, but not just any red, not the one forced on her in humiliation. This would be the red of her freedom. It started with a simple sketch, penciled into an old notebook beside the notes she took in her evening tailoring class. The line was shaky, but the dream was steady. She sketched and erased dozens of times, searching for balance. She wanted something strong but not arrogant, sensual but not vulgar. She wanted a woman upon wearing it to feel whole, not desired, not observed, simply sovereign over herself. With the little she'd saved in recent months, she bought remnants at a fabric market in the suburbs. No piece was large enough on its own, so she stitched them together patiently, a makeshift patchwork just to test the drape. For weeks, she tried shades of red. One was too dark, another too bright. None felt right. Until, one dawn, the sun came up through the window and bathed the fabric in a warm, gentle light. Olivia smiled. "That's it," she whispered. "The red of daybreak. That would be the tone of her dress, a red that doesn't shout, but is reborn." Meanwhile, the atelier was buzzing with preparations for Alexander Grant's new show. Practical as ever, Eleanor directed the seamstresses with firm guidance. "He wants perfection," she'd say. "And perfection is made of sweat and silence." Alexander's name circulated backstage again. Some idolized him, others feared him. Olivia, though, saw him differently now. When she came across patterns stamped with the golden logo, she no longer felt that old tightness in her chest. She felt only distance. He was still, by all accounts, the same arrogant man, demanding, temperamental, far removed from the hands that made his glory. But to her, it no longer mattered. His stage would be the same, but hers was being built in silence. Sometimes Eleanor noticed that Olivia stayed past closing, handling fabrics that didn't belong to any order. "What are you sewing there, girl?" she asked once, lifting a brow. Olivia hesitated. "It's a project of mine. Nothing big." Eleanor folded her arms. "Can I see?" "Not yet. It's ugly. It's just starting." Ugly is what stays hidden too long. Let the fabric breathe, or it dies before it's born. Olivia laughed, a little embarrassed, and promised to show it when it was further along. In the weeks that followed, she dedicated every spare hour to the dress. She took apart old textiles, basted with fine thread, cut leftover silk the atelier would have discarded. Her hands ached, her eyes burned, but she kept going. Sometimes she paused just to watch the fabric in the light. The red seemed to come alive, as if absorbing strength from her story. One night, Eleanor came into the atelier after hours and found her sewing in secret. Olivia jumped. "Ms. Eleanor, I was just—" But Eleanor motioned for silence and stepped closer. The dress was on the mannequin, half finished, still with loose threads and incomplete seams. Even so, there was something powerful about it. The fabric embraced the body's shape without vulgarity. The cut was bold yet elegant. The red, the exact shade of dawn, seemed to pulse. Eleanor watched quietly for a while. Then she said, "This dress has a soul." Olivia lowered her eyes. "I didn't want you to think I was disrespecting the work." "Disrespecting?" Eleanor cut in. "This is the opposite. It's what fashion should be. Soul, not vanity." She ran her expert fingers across the fabric. "You made this by yourself?" "Yes. I sewed it in my free time." "Then it's no longer a secret. It's a work, and every work deserves to be finished." From that day on, Eleanor decided to help her. They carried the project in silence, hidden from the other seamstresses. Sometimes they pretended to be doing alterations for an important client when, in truth, they were shaping Olivia's dress. Eleanor taught modeling tricks, the small subtleties only decades of experience reveal. The fabric needs to dance with the body, not fight it. Invisible stitching isn't to hide mistakes, it's to keep the eye free. As they worked together, a kind of kinship took root. Eleanor, who rarely showed affection, began to look at Olivia with admiration. "You know what you're doing, girl," she'd say. "You're sewing yourself back together." When the dress was finished, Olivia studied it in silence. The fabric seemed to breathe. The vivid red reflected off the atelier's white walls. She stepped closer, brushed the hem with her fingers, and felt her heart race. "I never thought I could create something like this." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Talent isn't born from glamour. It's born from pain, well sewn. You had the thread. You just needed the right needle." Outside, the world went on as usual. Alexander prepared his show, surrounded by flashes and promises. But in the small atelier, something was changing. Olivia's red dress waited, like a secret on the verge of being revealed. Not just a garment, but a quiet declaration of autonomy. And when she wore it for the first time, no one, not Alexander, not the past, would have power over the woman stitched together with courage. The hall was an ocean of lights and murmurs. Cameras blinked like electric fireflies, and the crackle of flashes blended with the hum of the crowd. It was the most anticipated night of the season. Alexander Grant's Winter Runway, broadcast live to magazines, influencers, and fashion channels around the world. Backstage, the air was thick with tension and expensive perfume. Fabrics fluttered like nervous wings, models slid between racks and mirrors, and every assistant darted about with clips, scissors, makeup. Among them, Olivia Carter walked in silence, discreet, her heart pounding like a drum. Eleanor Foster watched from a distance, steady, proud. For weeks they had stitched this plan together, saying no more than necessary. The red dress, hers, was ready, packed, tucked onto an ordinary rack among dozens of other pieces. A secret nestled between gold and black fabrics, waiting for the right moment. Across the hall, Alexander Grant reigned. With a mic clipped to his lapel, he issued orders in the same arrogant tone as always. "Careful with the final look. It's the most expensive," he barked. "And someone check the hem, please. The slightest mistake ruins the whole." His voice echoed, and everyone moved as if afraid to misstep. Olivia heard but didn't answer. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, the same man who had humiliated her, the same confident smile, surrounded by flatterers. Nothing about him seemed to have changed, but she had changed everything. The lights dimmed. The music began. The audience fell silent. The runway lit up, and the first model entered, draped in metallic shimmer. The sequence was impeccable, shades of gray, gold, black. Each look a cold, luxurious story. Alexander smiled, certain of his triumph. Backstage, Olivia watched through a slit in the curtain. Her heart thudded hard. Her palms were damp, but a strange calm had settled over her. The calm of someone who knows exactly what she's about to do. Eleanor came close, squeezed her shoulder, and whispered, "Now it's your turn, girl. No one can take this from you." Olivia nodded. She took off her apron, let down her hair, and slipped into the red. The fabric glided over her skin as if it recognized the body it had been made for. She cinched the waist, glanced in a makeshift mirror, and barely recognized herself. She was no longer the invisible cleaner, nor the timid apprentice. She was a whole woman, stitched in courage. The score swelled, cueing the final entrance. It was time. While the model assigned to the closing look was still waiting for a hem adjustment, Olivia walked to the wing, drew a long breath, and stepped out. The hall froze. For a heartbeat, no one understood what was happening. The runway threw white light onto the intense red moving across it. The dress wasn't part of the collection, it wasn't in the program. But no one cared. The audience raised their phones, mesmerized. The color looked alive. The fabric danced with her, obeying every step. Olivia walked with posture, eyes forward, not haughty, but free. In the wings, Alexander took a moment to notice. He'd been checking the next look when he heard the crowd's noise. Different. Electric. "What is that?" he demanded of an assistant. The man stammered. "It's a woman. I don't know who." Alexander peered through the curtain and went pale. It was her, the woman he had humiliated, the one whose pain he'd turned into a joke. Now she was there, in front of the cameras, wearing the most beautiful dress of the night. "Get her out of there!" he shouted, frantic. But no one moved. Photographers surged forward, cameras locked on her, and the audience, unaware of the backstory but feeling the force of the moment, rose to their feet, applauding. Olivia stopped at the center of the runway. The light fell on her, and the red burned like fire over ice. For an instant, time seemed to stop. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her gaze, calm, steady, said what words never could. "I got into the dress, not for your dare, for my own worth." The applause swelled. Alexander tried to charge forward, but Eleanor stepped in, firm. "Let her be," she said. "It's her turn." He stood frozen, defeated by his own shadow. When Olivia finished her walk, she gave a small bow. Nothing theatrical, just a simple gesture of gratitude. Then she returned backstage, past Alexander without looking at him, and handed the dress to Eleanor. "Mission accomplished," she said with a half smile. The designer tried to speak, but no sound came. Flashes popped, and the press team was already flooding the backstage. Within minutes, it was news. "Unknown woman steals the show at Alexander Grant's runway." The headlines read. The red dress no one saw coming. Social media exploded with videos, comments, comparisons. People wanted to know who the mysterious woman was, who had walked with such elegance and truth. Some thought it was part of the show, others a protest. But everyone agreed on one thing. That dress had something the others didn't. A soul. While Alexander scrambled to contain the damage, Olivia slipped out the side door into the cold, early morning air. Outside, far from the spotlights, she smiled for the first time in a long while. The red dress, now folded in her arms, seemed to glow even in the half-light. It was no longer a symbol of shame. It was one of quiet victory. The city slept. But that night, the fashion world woke up changed, and the name echoing across the networks was no longer Alexander Grant. It was Olivia Carter, the woman who entered the dress and left the runway owning herself. Months passed, and life, like fabric beneath a needle, began to realign. The fashion world was still talking about the show, the unexpected appearance of the woman in red who had outshone the country's most famous designer. Some called it an act of courage, others a scandal. But for Olivia Carter, it was simply the end of a cycle. She now worked in a small studio downtown. The walls were covered with patterns, colorful threads, and framed sayings that inspired the apprentices who passed through there. Olivia had become a design assistant and a mentor to young seamstresses. She taught patiently, spoke little, and when she corrected a mistake, she did it with the gentleness of someone who knew the weight of being invisible. The red dress, her dress, had gone out into the world. It was displayed in a student exhibit on fashion and social transformation. It wasn't in luxury windows, but in a community space illuminated by big windows and natural light. On the small card beside it, the text read, "Original dress made from repurposed fabrics, a symbol of freedom and dignity." She visited it sometimes, in silence, like reuniting with an old piece of herself. The red still shone, but now it seemed calm. Not fire, a rising sun. Across the city, Alexander Grant lived the opposite of the glamour that had once surrounded him. After the show, contracts began to vanish. Brands dropped him, magazines stopped mentioning him, and former partners called him difficult. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself alone, without the audience that upheld his ego. In the months that followed, he avoided mirrors and cameras. He was replaced by newer names, younger, humbler, more authentic. It took time to understand, but one day he realized his downfall hadn't come from Olivia's boldness. It had come from his own pride. So he began to change. Little by little, he relearned the craft itself. He went back to sketching by hand, sewing, visiting workshops, listening to the seamstresses he had once ignored. And one autumn afternoon, when he heard the red dress would be shown in a public exhibit, he decided to go. Not out of pride, out of reparation. The space was simple, but full of life. Young students walked between mannequins, studying the pieces and jotting down ideas. Olivia was there helping organize the display when she heard a voice that made her freeze. "It's more beautiful than in the photos." She turned. Alexander Grant stood there, changed, his hair slightly gray, his eyes tired, without the artificial gleam that used to follow him. He wore a simple shirt, no suit, no pose. Olivia stayed quiet for a moment. Then she breathed in and said, "I didn't expect to see you here." He gave a faint smile. "I didn't expect to have the courage to come." They walked together to the dress. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile. Alexander looked at the piece for a long time, then spoke softly. "You know, when I saw you on that runway, something in me broke. Not because of public embarrassment, but because I realized what I called art was vanity. You showed me what truth is." Olivia kept her eyes on the dress. "I didn't do it to humiliate you." "I know," he nodded. "And that's exactly why it hurt more. You didn't want to destroy anything, you just wanted to be free." He paused, then added, "I owe you an apology." She glanced at him, serene. "You don't owe me anything. What's past is past." But Alexander insisted, "It's not for me. It's for you," he said, sincere. "The way I treated you, it was cruel. I saw people as parts of my spectacle. I was wrong." Olivia took a deep breath. The old anger no longer lived in her. "Time has already given back what you took," she said. "Dignity. And that, Alexander, you can't buy, you build." He lowered his head, moved. "I want to do something useful, truly, to set things right." She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Invest in the invisible." "Invisible?" "The seamstresses, the porters, the embroiderers whose names never make the label, the ones who make the art happen and are never seen. Create scholarships, workshops, opportunities. Give a stage to those who have only thread and courage." For the first time in a long while, Alexander smiled. "I can do that," he said. "Not out of guilt, but gratitude. You gave me my footing back." Olivia nodded. "Then that's it. The circle closes when what wounded heals." For a few seconds, they stood side by side, watching the red dress under the soft light. The piece seemed to pulse, alive, a silent witness to two paths that crossed through pain and ended in understanding. Alexander sighed. "Red has never looked so beautiful." "Because now it doesn't belong to anyone," Olivia replied. "It belongs to all of us." He said goodbye with a respectful handshake and left in silence. Outside, the wind carried autumn leaves, and Alexander walked away as if he'd set down an immense weight. Olivia remained, looking at the dress. One of the students approached and asked, "Professor, this is the dress from that runway, right?" She smiled. "It is. And now it's the dress of everyone who learned to sew their own story." The young woman stared, wide-eyed. "It's perfect." "No," Olivia said. "It's human, and that's what makes it beautiful." The lights began to dim, and the hall bathed in the orange glow of late afternoon. Olivia walked to the window, looked at the horizon, and smiled. The past had been sewn stitch by stitch until it became only memory, and the red, the one that once stood for shame, now shone as a witness to the quiet courage of beginning again. And you? What would be the red dress in your life, the step that would make you feel truly in charge of yourself? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear your story. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but to keep this spark of starting over alive.